Welcome to Perspective. Now, just last year, the world reached a tipping point. More than half of humanity now lives in urban areas and not the countryside. Now, in Asia, 45% of the population now lives in cities. This has implications on resources, growth and the environment. Now, tonight, we put a spotlight on environmental sustainability. Can we here in Asia grow without harming the environment? Who's responsible for responsible growth? Now, joining me tonight are Professor Tommy Koh, Ambassador-at-Large at Singapore's Foreign Affairs Ministry, Professor Wong Kang-Woo, Chairman of the East Asian Institute, Associate Professor Simon Tay, Chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, and Mr. Lee Zhu-Yang, Chairman of Shell Companies in Singapore. Now, welcome all of you to the program. Prof. Koh, I'm just going to start with you because just this week, the Rio +20 Earth Summit concluded. The reports coming out have criticized it for not quite achieving anything in terms of targets, numbers and commitments. Do you think Asia should at all care about what happens at Rio +20?
Absolutely. Asia is part of the world. Asia should care very much what happens at a global level as well as at the regional level. From the reports I've read, most people are critical of the modest outcome of Rio +20 and compare it unfavorably to the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio. Maybe the comparison's unfair because the areas in which we needed global agreement, whether on climate change, biodiversity, to combat desertification, have been done. The challenge now is not to have more new global agreement, but to implement what we already have and to create partnerships between government, business, civil society, all levels of government to get the job done. So it is true the outcome in Rio +20 is very modest. The two focal points are promoting the green economy and upgrading the institutional structure for supporting the environment at a global level.
Picking up from that point, Professor Tay, I mean, Prof. Koh has said that maybe we should focus on what's already there, but let's talk about what was there before. So from the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, I mean, the US didn't sign up to it, didn't ratify the treaty. Is there any sense in still then having these large international meetings and groupings to discuss or try to come to some sort of agreements, or when we can't even enforce what was agreed on before?
I think the Rio 20 strikes me as being like a sort of an old school reunion, and the charming girls of sustainable development that you thought were so beautiful at the time have become less elegant and less winning in the last 20 years. In this sense, there is a bit of a nostalgia to me, whereas the action, I think as Prof. Koh said, has rightly gone into the climate change negotiations. We are at a time where there is some movement on climate change. This meeting did not help particularly, but I don't think it's hurt it. So that's hopefully going to move forward. The other thing that I think we should be looking at is how much corporations and governments are really trying to do. The agreements, etc., don't worry about them too much because statements only take you so far. I mean, they're important, but they take you so far. I think in the last 20 years, we've seriously come to the point where no leader will say, forget about the environment, I'll do things that are unsustainable. At least lip service must be paid. More than that, I think that private companies are starting to invest into the right technologies and starting to move projects.
Well, companies that come in also for some criticism at the conclusion of the Rio +20, particularly from people who are in environmental movement saying that companies actually have too much political power and clout with governments because of the big amount of budget they have in controlling certain legislation. What do you think actually that companies today have truly embraced sustainable development and are doing the right things globally?
Well, as always, I think there's a wide range of approaches, but certainly the diversity in terms of new technologies, new investments, new business models to try and tackle this enormous opportunity that is the green economy, I think has really multiplied. The challenge, of course, is that this is at a very early stage. And history tells us that when you're trying to start up a new business, it is going to be difficult. And new technologies take decades to become commercially accepted and viable. And perhaps not all will succeed. But certainly I don't think there is a lack of trying today.
Prof. Wang, do you think that the green economy is a concept that Asian governments have embraced fully enough?
I think basically everybody's agreed on the ideals behind it. I think when Professor Koh were talking about implementation, I was thinking that how do you get people to actually organize or institutionalize the means of implementing together? Yeah, I think these are real problems because each country or each region has its own priorities. And if the priorities don't agree, even if you share the same ideals, how do you time it in such a way that everybody's moving at the same time? Because some countries would rightly say they're not ready for it. There are other things that are more urgently needed. Economic development is, they keep on emphasizing. They're not going to stop growing. And those that are developed shouldn't be asking them to stop now when they are at a crucial stages. How do you do that?
Nobody's saying that Asia should stop growing or slow down. Nobody's saying that. But people are saying that this century is actually China and India's growth story. China and India have the skill and the potential to either benefit the world or to pollute the world. And it is in our collective interest to encourage China and India to embrace the green economy, to transition as rapidly as possible to a low carbon economy. And while you are growing, while you still need to emit carbon, but it doesn't mean that you're exempted from all responsibility. This is why there's no replacement for a new global agreement on burden sharing as far as greenhouse gas emission is concerned, as far as climate change is concerned.
That's one of the changes, I think, between 92 and now. I think that the rhetoric of developing countries, including Malaysia, our near neighbor at that time, was very much, is this a trap to stop us from developing?
Yes.
And I think that changed to saying, can we now find a new path for development? And so one of the principles, common and differentiated responsibilities, which started in Rio, or strengthened in Rio, has really metamorphosed, morphed. It's changed and grown stronger, but different, to also mean that developing countries too have responsibility.
The rhetoric has completely changed.
I think it's true that even developed countries now admit that they have something to...
Historical responsibility.
They have to accept that. But it's a question of finding the right timing and how to steer the thing in such a way that everybody is coming to, to the same conclusion, same end.
If I could be boastful and draw all of our attention back to principle number 7 in the Rio Declaration, which says all of us have a responsibility, but for historical reason, for reason of our different capacities, we have common but differentiated responsibility. Differentiated doesn't mean no responsibility. It could mean reduced responsibility, but all of us can make a contribution to greenhouse gas emission reduction.
Looking at the record so far, I have a feeling that there is a genuine difference between big countries getting things done and small countries getting things done. It seems to be, on the whole, easier for small countries to adjust, to make the decisions, to make fundamental changes to the way they do things. But when you have very big countries, different regions with different needs, even within the country, they have different, as it were, priorities and so on. The leadership, the political system, the question of governance and responsibility, how can the leaders make all parts of his own country, all these big countries, agree to do something? And it applies to both the United States, the developed country, and
we didn't sign up to
China, another one.
Yes.
But you look at the actual politics of it all. It's extremely difficult. I can't see how these political leaders can actually get their people to get on even on the same platform.
But the advances that have been made have been that the political leaders are now around the table, and I think both the attitudes perhaps of the developed countries, but also the BRICS, as we have seen also in the parallel discussions on climate change, they are now part of that discussion, and it's accepted that we cannot make progress on just an Annex 1 list, for example. But the real progress will not depend only on political developments. I think we will need to get communities, we will need to get business, organizations involved, because this is a collaborative effort. I think we discovered, I think quite some time ago, that no one party can tackle this alone.
I would say to Gang Hu that it's true. that governing a large country like China or India is of course more complex and challenging than governing the Singapore. But the good news is that in the last 20 years, it is not just the national government that is pushing environmental development, but regional government, local government, municipal government. If you look at the United States, some of the cities and states of the United States are way ahead of the federal government. And the good news is that many companies are taking the lead, you know, and civil society and so on.
On the sidelines, for example, of meetings at Davos and so on, which are attended by many leading business leaders, discussions are going on, and many more businesses are now talking about how to collaborate and how to work on environmental challenges.
All right, so we'll have to go for a short break. When we return, we'll speak about clean energy and whose business is it? Thank you for staying with us on Perspectives. Now, I just want to pick up on the issue of urbanization and more and more Asians living in cities today, and what sort of load that places on a country or a region's Asia's energy needs. Because energy, after all, is the consumption of energy is the dominant contributor to climate change. So, in terms of development, whose business is it today? Whose business do you all think it is to encourage clean energy and clean energy development in Asia? Simon?
I think first the cities. I think clearly you're right in the sense that cities tend to intensify use. They provide opportunities, jobs, they are drivers of the economy, but that always means they use more energy, which generally means more carbon. But I think we're reaching a point where we've realized, not just in the Rio Plus 20, but in the Cities 40, C40, and other forums, that really cities can take a lead and start to really drive the issue, because a city, compared to what Prof. Wang said earlier, it's a very manageable size. The city has a mayor, it has planning, and you can have collaboration very much at the tactile level between the private sector and the city governance. So one example is EcoCity Tianjin. Singapore is working with China to bring in private sector development, developing the greenfield project so that the overall plan for transport, etc., the load is reduced, and clean energy can start it.
I might add that with cities, we have higher standards of education, the awareness, the degree to which people are actually involved in eco-friendly activities and so on. That's really quite fantastic growth.
I think we shouldn't demonize cities. First, the trend towards urbanization is irreversible. This is a historic paradigm shift in the world. So we myself say we are now living in the urban world. The challenge for us is how can we turn our city into sustainable city, livable city? And how do we encourage cities to embrace best practices in the efficient use of energy, of water, natural resource, in doing all the good things that make a city livable? And I think in this respect, there is an agreement, I think, on the part of many city leaders that this is the challenge of this century.
So the growing cities of Asia can hopefully leapfrog their counterparts in the West, which have older cities, which are more of a burden.
Well, Asia has the largest cities in the world. 9 of the 10 largest cities in terms of population are in Asia. So in terms of a load that places on these mega cities and infrastructure, do you think enough is being done to develop in a sustainable way?
The urbanization actually depends not on growth of mega cities. In fact, there will be many, many more cities of perhaps the size of Singapore, certainly less than 10 million. Simon, you referred to the C40. I think the importance of city-level political leadership and city-level collaboration between policymakers and the people who live in the cities and the people who market their products and services in the cities will become increasingly important. Hence, we see the growth of discussions between city leaders at various forums like the C40.
Let's talk about energy itself as a source. I mean, clean energy source. China has led the way in terms of technology.
But could I say on energy that maybe we shouldn't begin by talking about clean energy? I mean, we should just talk about the importance of energy, that you need energy to maintain our way of life, to power economy. There is no replacement for energy. And there are different sources of energy. The largest source is still coal,
Fossil fuels. Yeah,
followed,
coal.
followed by oil, followed by gas. You have renewables such as hydro, nuclear energy, solar, wind. Biogas, biofuel. But those are rather small sources, you know. Since Tzu Yang
In total
is from the
terms-
oil industry, I would say
Yes.
to him that
We're only part of it.
that for the, no, but I think for the foreseeable future, whether it's Asia or the world, we have no choice but to continue to rely on the three fossil fuels of
Yes.
coal, oil,
Just to
and
give
gas.
some numbers to what you're saying,
Yeah.
Tommy. Today, it's about 250 million barrels of oil equivalent in total, of which about 200, so let's say about 80% of that is fossil fuels, of which the majority is coal. And there's about 50 million barrels of oil equivalent a day that is being from all the other sources, including nuclear and renewables. Renewables is only a couple of million barrels of oil equivalent a day. That portion, the green part of it, is going to grow, and it's going to grow exponentially. But it's going to grow from a very small base. And there's a lot of different technologies which still have to prove themselves, and the combinations that will succeed is still unclear. So the expectation is that by the year 2050, when there will be 9 billion people on the planet, of which perhaps 3/4 will be in cities, still 2/3 of our energy requirements will be dependent on a mix of fossil fuels, and perhaps 1/3 will be on new energy. So it is very important to deal with the outcomes of using fossil fuel, because that's going to be the reality. We cannot only depend on replacement. We need all the forms of energy, and we need to be able to make all these forms clean.
So,
China-
in terms of,
sorry.
yes, dealing with the outcomes in terms of pollution, air quality, water quality, pollution, and so on, are we doing enough then? I mean,
Well, if you look at China,
Yes.
clearly it's trying to do everything. It is growing green energy. It's become one of the leading solar panel builders of the world. But they still have some of the dirtiest air in the
Exactly.
cities in the
Cool.
world. So it is like China's growth and India's growth and Asia's growth as a whole is omnivorous. It's not as if they're becoming vegetarian. They're not as if they're all going green. They have to have all the forms. So we actually, in a way, I think what Tsai Yang is saying is completely understood for the long term. It's going to be quite a long haul. We need actually to find ways to tie the immediate solutions so that there's immediate payback. For example, cleaning air. Some countries, some cities have moved towards using public transport which is green, either solar, hybrid, or CNG.
rail, yeah.
So it lowers the diesel load in the center of the city. And it's not just a carbon question, it's the immediate effects on the health of the citizens. So in New Delhi, I mean, though it's still very bad, the judges have pushed this through.
CNG vehicles, yes.
There are tests in Singapore, we're test bedding 30 electric cars, too few. I think we have hardly ever seen one on the road because there are only 30 of them running around. I think we need to be bolder so that we can see the evidence and test it.
But should
That
the
is
lead-
something that definitely depends on the big companies.
Yes.
When the question of how they can change their technology. They can't do it overnight, and I think
No,
this
but
is
the
one of the
technology is there, you know.
questions there.
It's a question of cost, and it's a question of political will.
Well, it's
I mean, for
it's a question
example,
of
that is a
capital-
technological
It's a
problem.
question of capital base.
Yeah.
So as we have seen with the transport companies in Singapore, it's not that easy to change your capital base when you've got a certain group and you want to have a more efficient. It takes time to be able to reinvest. And I think what needs to be done, and I absolutely agree with Simon, is that the policy framework needs to be there to give stability, to encourage investment in the change of that capital base to adopt the new technology. And in that experimentation, I think we need to look not just at the outcomes in terms of the tailpipe emissions, the local impact. We need to look at the end-to-end. Because when you create electric vehicles, how are they actually built, and where do the batteries come from? And it's a well-to-wheel challenge when you look at the planet. It's not just what happens in your backyard.
But it's also a question of attitude and value, because in Asia, we pride ourselves for being practical and pragmatic, but I would say we also need to be bold and visionary.
I think we need to say a dirty word here in Singapore.
Yeah?
Subsidies. Not general, make everyone lazy subsidies. But targeted subsidies to get the policies right are important. Because oil prices fluctuate, especially the economy is down right now. Oil prices being on a trend downwards. How do you invest in a new technology which may be marginal at best when you're not certain where oil is going to go and the shale gas?
Who would you want to subsidize? Who should the government subsidize then? The consumer or the producer?
I think the governments have to start thinking about investing in technology. This means, and test bedding. So, for example, in Korea, they have made a sizable bet, a sizable investment on subsidies for producing CNG buses. And I think that's, of course, partly the industrial policy since they produce buses there. But it's something that we need to think about.
I wouldn't use the word subsidy, which is a dirty word in some parts of Asia. I mean, to give an example, the Singapore government is going to spend $1.1 billion to buy a new fleet of 550 buses. So my appeal is, why not consider the slight marginal cost of buying electric buses or hybrid buses instead of the normal buses?
This is
the cost is marginal, but the health benefit, the collateral benefit is enormous.
To get something really implemented, very often a lot of goodwill, a lot of general ideas about everything needs to be done. But if you actually do things one at a time, perhaps some things, I know there's urgency everywhere, but you do need focus on some things. I've given some examples of this. For example, when the Montreal Protocol came out, all the things were very focused on the
CFC,
CFCs and you know,
and we succeeded.
A very good example of when you are very clear about what is wrong, and people can actually get on with it. And that's very successful.
That was an easier problem to solve.
All right, but it's an example
climate change.
Focus of
that was an easier problem
But
to
also
solve.
maybe perhaps the science was clearer that the ozone layer was being depleted by CFCs.
And it was easier to find the
it was easier to find substitutes
in a short enough space of time.
Yes.
For energy, we've not found a substitute, frankly.
But to come back to energy, my question to Tzu Yang, since you're from the energy industry, is whether the great oil companies like Shell, could not only help to produce cleaner fuel and help solve some of the unsolved problems of the use of coal, for example, the sequestration and disposal of carbon, but also could you expand your portfolio to include clean energy?
We have expanded our portfolio.
Sorry to interrupt you there. We'll pick that question up when we return. We'll hear from Mr. Lee Zhu Yang. Welcome back to Perspectives. Now, before the break, Professor Koh was just throwing a question to Mr. Lee Zhu Yang about whether or not the large oil companies can actually develop clean energy as one of your core businesses.
Expand the portfolio.
Expand it in the portfolio. What do you say to that?
I think we should not be specific about solutions. We should look at outcomes. And the outcome that we are seeking is to try to minimize the impact on local pollution, certainly, but ultimately on climate change. Part of that would be to reduce the carbon intensity of the energy that we consume. Even within the fossil fuel portfolio, there are fuels which are significantly less carbon intensive. So this year already, my company is selling more gas than oil. And I think the move towards gas, and in particular, not just in substitution of oil, but potentially in substitution of coal, would make the most significant contribution in terms of available technology, deployed capital assets today, and available supply of that fuel. So I think the shift in terms of the mix of fossil fuel is one thing, development of green energies is another, and just the way that we run our own operations, and for this it's not just the oil companies, but it's industry as a whole, it's housing. In temperate climates, it would be how we do our home heating. The more efficient we can use the fuel, the less impact we will have on the environment.
Just give some numbers. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but moving from coal to gas can cut about a third of the carbon. And then energy efficiency, most experts says 25% is achievable by most cities, most companies quite easily. And some talk about 40 or even 50.
So aren't governments pushing this ahead more? In Asia, why aren't governments pushing it
they
ahead
are.
more?
Singapore government has, for example, announced that it intends to reduce by 35% the carbon intensity of per dollar GDP produced by the Singapore economy. And this is an ambitious goal, you know. I mean, we already rank quite well for carbon intensity, but to reduce that by 35% is an ambitious goal. And I think it's achievable.
Also on the buildings and energy efficiency, the new buildings achieving platinum mark, etc., that's been a demonstrable step forward. But I
think Singapore has a relatively good record on this, but I can't think of many other governments that can easily get so many things going at the same time. This is in the end, it comes back to how people implement those ideas.
It's partly price signals too. Price signals too matter a lot. Energy in Singapore is expensive. I mean, I think most things are very expensive. But energy particularly has a point of its price. That way, people learn to be efficient. Or there's a reason buildings can actually have a payback by being more efficient.
Well, that's the whole question.
Comes back to your dirty word, subsidy.
Subsidy, yes, I was just going to say that.
Subsidizing the right type. Subsidizing the right kind of investments and not subsidizing the wrong kind of consumption. I think that's a critical part.
So Rio Plus 20 wanted to put in place a plan for governments to remove subsidies for fossil fuels, but it didn't happen. So do you think more governments around Asia should be looking at things like that? Because it would have an impact in the long...
in the way. I mean, you know, in Indonesia, we've seen their president back away from exactly that same issue because an election is coming up in 2 years. To be fair to, I mean, it's also a political issue in America if energy prices and petrol prices get too high.
But if there's one lesson that business has learned, is that price signals are very, very important, both to the investor as well as to the consumer. So, you know, I very much would favor getting to a more level playing field in terms of the approach towards opening up the market for all fuels. But in doing so, I think we need to price carbon. When you have different fuels, pricing them just on the calorific value is not enough. The carbon intensity does matter.
So Young, would you support or oppose an idea that's often been discussed in Asia of imposing a carbon tax?
We are actually looking at both the tax and the trade aspects. And in fact, I can understand the attractions of the approach towards tax because it is simpler for an individual government to apply. But for the global system to work better, you actually need to have a market in carbon. And you need to be able then to provide the incentives through that market for investments to reduce the carbon intensity in the most efficient way. Because the efficiency of the investment can only be improved if it is not just in this market, but can be valued in other markets as well.
Isn't there already a nascent global market for carbon? There's carbon trading.
It's not
and you
yet.
Also have CDMs.
It's not yet fully global.
But why doesn't it work? I mean, the ideas have been there for quite some time, and lots of people have been planning for it.
The political framework within which, for example, the European emissions trading scheme set up was, I would say, over-generous in terms of its credits. And when there was an economic slowdown, they actually had a surplus of credits. So the price of carbon actually fell far too low. We need actually to have a robust price on carbon to actually incur change, to incentivize change.
So for forms of carbon, if I hear you, as well?
Well, different fuels would have a different carbon intensity, and therefore, if you price the carbon in, they would change accordingly.
On the Kyoto Protocol, I think the prices have been falling down to maybe $3 now. It's as low as $3 at some time. So it's been on the downward trend, getting cheaper.
I want to move away from energy discussion to pollution and to impact on the environment in terms of development. Well, I'll ask maybe perhaps slightly provocative question. Why is it forests are still being cleared and you see deforestation in Asia, in Indonesia, if the legislation is all there, the laws are all in place to prevent these things from going on? Is it business, is it government,
because there's money to be made. There are greedy people, you have a weak rule of law and poor governance. And so this will continue to happen.
Well, I think that first, clearly, the economic incentives are not there. Every tree that's standing, you may like the beauty of the tree, but to the forester, that's a plank that can be sold. So for developing countries, and that's where most of these tropical hardwoods are, it's a no-brainer, because the only way to develop, and developed countries did this as well, is to clear the forest, sell the wood, and open up for agriculture or plantations. And so we've got to change the paradigm. It's not a crazy decision. It's actually a logical decision for them unless we change the paradigm.
It is a mindset for growth, isn't it?
No,
is
but
it
I'm not against cutting down tree per se,
Yes.
What I'm against is illegal logging. Yes. What I'm against is unsustainable forestry management.
Correct. So
if countries that have forests do it in a responsible way, I have no objection.
I think in the same way that urban planning is important, so is rural planning, so is the planning of our natural resources.
Yes.
And I think there are two ways to handle the question of change of land use, which underlies a lot of these issues. You can penalize it when it is done wrongly, or you can try and incentivize it when it is done well.
Yes.
And I would again tend to favor the incentivization to actually make it popular and profitable for the farmers and so on to use their land efficiently and to clear their land efficiently.
And the clearing of the land is by big companies. It's not the farmer who's doing it.
Well, that's where the policy frameworks must come in. Perhaps there needs to be a bit of carrot and stick. But if it were purely stick, I don't think it would work.
Isn't it political will as well?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is.
Absolutely.
Clearly, that's why I think Popco is correct, that a lot of the illegal logging, certainly no one should be in favor of that. But there are ways to get it right. So, for example, you mentioned carbon credits. If that is a heavily forested area or peatland, as tropical peatlands have a lot of carbon stored in them, one could actually do a kind of a deal where you could sell the credits, the carbon credits, get money for keeping the peatlands, keeping the forest, and then, rather than locking people out of the forest, create livelihoods, new livelihoods within. So the choice not stark. I either clear the forest and make tons of money, or keep the forest and make no money. It has to be, I can keep the forest and find a livelihood.
Well, how do you all think ASEAN has done in this respect? I mean, we've been talking about transboundary haze, which is a form of pollution, which is, through forest fires and logging. So how do you all think ASEAN has done in this respect? Prof. Koh.
Well, we have the agreement, but I think of the 10 ASEAN countries, one has not ratified it. And
we haven't solved it yet. I think that it's not just an ASEAN problem. The amount of carbon emitted really makes it a global problem. Indonesia, because of land degradation and the forest fires included, is top 5 in the world for carbon release. And it doesn't have to be that way. What I said about forest carbon credits can actually replicate themselves in various schemes. To be fair to the governments of ASEAN, the treaty has not been the only thing they've been doing. They've actually made progress. So Singapore have worked in Jambi with Indonesia, unheard of even 10 years ago. There's been progress, and so we've probably never seen as bad the haze, touch wood, as we saw in 97, 98. Partly because of temperature and partly because land clearance isn't as large scale, but partly I think some of the policies have become better. But zero burning, I think, is going to be hard unless we really start to find ways to make it incentivize them to keep that land, keep that peatland.
But the incentive is on the table. Our Norwegian friends have put billions of dollars on the table on a scheme which is called REDD+, the reduction of emission through deforestation and degradation of forests. So the incentive is there. The question is whether countries that are host to these rainforests will accept the incentives and comply with the rules. If I could just say globally, the picture is not a pretty one. In the last 50 years, the world has lost 1/3 of our forests. And the forests in Southeast Asia are disappearing right before our eyes.
And on that note, we're going for another short break. When we return, let's talk about environmental impact assessments and whether we're doing enough with companies and governments. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us on Perspectives. Now, with the forest disappearing before our eyes, do you think putting in environmental impact assessments for projects at the government level or for businesses would help alleviate some of these
I
problems?
think all governments know that that is what they should be doing, and in fact, I can't imagine any government saying no to that in principle. But even if you did it, but if you don't have the means of checking or inspecting and making sure that everything follows after your impact assessment, all that, I think it's a question of governance. It comes back, unfortunately, to questions of will, question of the structure of the system, the bureaucracies of the officials, the expertise of the officials, the degree to which they are encouraged to actually make these proper reports and checking all the time to make sure that these things work. The theory is there, and everybody knows the laws are being passed and so on. The progress has been enormous when you consider 20 years ago, very few governments bothered. But today, I can't imagine a government disagreeing with that. They will all say, yes, a good idea. But many of them haven't actually prepared the ground to ensure that the assessment having been made, there are all the means of making sure that everything is done accordingly. And then I think is where it comes back to leadership, governance, but I think education too, the training of the technical skills.
Many businesses, I would say, such as mine today, do this as a matter of course. It is part of our policy. The issue, of course, is that we should not be doing this ourselves. We should be subjecting this to an open discussion. And so developing indeed that ability in the wider economy, in academia and in consultancy to actually do the environmental impact assessments and to be able to explain the reasons and the results to a wider, inevitably political audience, I think is important. And that's also part of the green economy.
Can I jump in at that point? I'm in favor of EIAs, make it clear. I think that's a participation process. But that participation is going to be political. So you look at our near neighbor now, what's happening with this rare earth plant Linus they're trying to start. You know, it's played into a whole dynamic not only of the environmental issue, but of basically of which political party do you want to support. You know, so
and the economics of it.
Yes, that too. So I think we really have to see that there is a need to make citizens more aware. But it doesn't always mean that the corporations are doing the wrong thing or the government's always lying. So it's got to be a much trickier process, and it's going to take more time.
How long do you think it'll take for the green economy to get to where we where it should get to? I mean, it's a $1 question.
It's a new business, so I think we should give it every chance and every support. But we need more people to play in this space. And it is going to be, like many new businesses, a risky business. So I think we all have to decide what we're good at and play in that part of it. It cannot be that because I want to be a green entrepreneur, I try all green technologies. I have to understand those in which I have a competitive advantage and which I'm more likely to succeed.
And I think we made a beginning, you know. I mean, 20 years ago, who could imagine that there would be a water industry in Singapore? But we do. We become a world thought leader in water. We have water industry, industry related to water. In the same way, I like to Singapore develop a new green economy in the area of energy, of transportation, of urban planning.
You see, this is where it requires planning and looking quite far ahead, a decade or two.
But we're good at that.
But I'm not sure how many governments are actually bothering to do that. And the governance part comes back again, because if you're continually looking at your political constituency and worrying too much about whether they will support you this round or not, you're not likely to do that kind of long-term planning. You're not likely to follow up enough of it. This is, I think, the danger. The danger is
that's
where
why, you know, like all the politicians, you've got to figure out the long-term, how it connects to the immediate. So if you can tie the carbon load to cleaner air, I think people can quite immediately see. You can tie the carbon load to helping get rid of the haze 1 or 2 weeks when we suffer it, or KL suffering it now. That would be something very visible and tangible. And you've got to be quite sharp at picking icons and trying to say they can be better.
Isn't it also about tying development and poverty alleviation to cleaner energy sources as well?
Exactly.
And
so
are there enough projects on the ground in Asia?
And it comes down to leadership, and it's not just politics, it's also corporate. It is the role of the leader to inspire his constituency with his vision, and that they shouldn't just invest for the short term, but they should also invest for the medium and longer term.
And that's why I think we're really failing, not so much Singapore, but globally. You know, even with dealing with the financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, there seems so little real leadership agreement, let alone the environmental crisis. I think, frankly, that while we had the Rio 20 meeting, a fairly large meeting, because of the G20 meeting and the concerns about global economy as a whole, the lack of voice, lack of attention, and lack of leadership in this area has become very clear.
Yeah, I'm somewhat concerned that, because of the recent issues in the financial world, that there is a growing distrust of big business. I think it is important to enlist all players to the pump. And business is one of those that we cannot do without. I'm a technology optimist, which means that I think that given the right incentives, we can find technology solutions to many of the problems that we have today. Many of them are with us, waiting to be deployed. For them to be successfully deployed, we actually need models that work both business-wise and politically. So human behavior actually has to change.
Do you think with enough will to change human behavior to consume less as Asia develops more?
I think there are two levels. At one level, yes, you need the immediate decisions, the will to do something, immediate plans to do something. But you, at the same time, do have to think that this is a long-term thing. And in the meantime, you've got to build up the capacity and the skills and the technology, continue to build on it. I'm not quite sure whether universities and schools and so on have been doing enough to train the kind of people who are environmentally conscious.
But there are role models in Asia. We don't have to look to Europe for a role model, although Europe is far ahead in this area. But just look at Asia. The country and people of Japan, the people in South Korea, the people of Taiwan have overtaken us in terms of the embrace of sustainable development, green economy. If I could give one example, in the area of the recycling of waste, all these places have laws requiring the segregation of waste, which we don't, And we in Singapore may think that Koreans, Taiwanese are more unruly than we are, but they are very civic conscious.
But if I could add to that, I don't think the success of recycling is only dependent on legislation. Those communities have a lot of peer pressure.
On the people.
The cultural expectation.
And I'm very impressed that the people in South Korea and the Taiwanese,
but it was a long-term thing. It didn't start overnight. It probably, again, 2 or 3 decades.
But it gives me hope, you see, that what the Japanese can do, what the South Koreans can do, what the Taiwanese can do, the rest of us in Asia can also do.
But do you think the Chinese and Indians can do that?
I was
That's the largest.
I was always trained to agree with my elders and betters, but the problem I see is time. While we're saying that things do need time, societies need to have the habits, we're running out of time, and not just in terms of when the next meeting is, but every study is showing that climate change is happened.
It has happened.
Yeah, I think exhortations to consume less can only achieve so much. I think you really need to make it worth people's while to consume less. There must actually be an economic as well as a feel-good factor. The pure feel-good factor itself will not reduce the effect.
I would also say that it's easier for people who are in a developed country or who are relatively better off to then have that feel-good factor when poverty alleviation would be the key. And we may not be looking at that.
The outcome of the less has to be an outcome rather than the driver. The driver has to be adoption of new technology, new planned cities, new ways to meet the demand, not to deny the demand.
I also think that even though we are facing an existential issue from climate change, fear cannot be the driver either. Fear can keep people awake for one night, but cannot shape the overall behavior. I think it has to be very much incentives, rewards, and simply, in a way, designing it so it becomes the normal way. So this generation of Taiwanese or Swiss or whatever sort their ways as just it's normal.
It's also what Kang Hu said, education.
It does take time, unfortunately. I know you feel that urgent, but you just consider how much progress we have made. I know that we're unsatisfied with it. You don't think it's enough. But actually there has been tremendous progress in the last 20, 30 years. The consciousness today, the young generation today talk about it quite naturally in a way that when I was young, nobody talked about it. So that's a major shift. And I don't think we should underestimate that, the power of public opinion and cultural change.
When you were young, Gandhi said that if his India was to become as rich as England, because the richest country at the time, he basically thought it could not because It took a whole empire to make England that rich. How many planets? And I think in the rise of Asia, I hope that many young people are also seeing this question, how many planets? But I think not. And sometimes the headlong greed is getting to Asia. I agree that it's not simply consume less, that cannot be the message. But there must be some form of efficiency or some way of greening that economy. And I'm afraid, the Rio has not come to an answer.
But I want to be optimistic. I want to believe that it's possible for us to nurture a new generation of young Asians who understand that we are facing an enormous crisis, and that they embrace and internalize and make it part of their own value system and lifestyle, that they wish to live in harmony with nature.
Tzu Yang, from business, do you share the optimistic view?
I am always looking for ways in which we can grow our markets, and I think if we can make a success of the new behaviors, it can only be done by actually developing ways in which people can make money. Because there's a tremendous incentive to have a better life. And if we do not allow people to have a better life, you will not have peace. Part of getting to a better life must be an economic incentive. The question is, how do we provide that in a responsible and sustainable way?
Thank you very much on that optimistic note. Thank you, Tzu Yang. Thank you, Bob Huang, Simon, Bob Koh. Asia is touted as the engine for global growth. Can we do it in a sustainable manner and be mindful of the trade-offs if we continue to ignore environmental protection? We hope the discussion has stimulated thinking on what individuals, governments and businesses can do to protect the environment. Remember, you are important to us. Do help us shape the next episode of Perspectives. Keep writing, connecting with us by leaving your comments on our website, and you can tweet to us as well. Join us again next month on Perspectives. Good night. Thank you all very much.